Well, it's a little bit cold outside, but I'll bet if we look, we can find signs of life all over. Well, of course, you already know that there's a lot of life to be found in our region any season of the year, even winter. And in fact, we've taken you on this show to explore some of that wintertime and early spring life. We know that we can go to a pine tree and see that it's evergreen. We know that we can go find a holly bush or a holly tree and find evergreen leaves. What I'm curious about, what about those trees that are deciduous? They have lost their leaves. What about those plants that look like they're dormant? I'll bet if we look close, we can find some signs of life even in those. Let's go see what we can find. Well, we don't have to go far to find our first signs of wintertime life, but we do have to look pretty close up. This is a really small and beautiful wildflower. It's not native to our area, I don't believe. It's called bird's eye speedwell. And this little plant, along with dead nettle, is one of the earliest seasonal bloomers. Well, here's a really interesting tree that we can identify any time of year. This is a tree that's still mostly asleep right now in the cold months of the year. But if we look closely, we can see some signs that it's starting to wake up. The first thing that you might notice any time of year are the presence of these little structures that look a lot like cones. Well, now that's a strange thing to find on a broadleaf tree. This is a deciduous tree. This is an angiosperm. This is a flowering plant, and it has these little structures that we call cones. But these aren't true cones like a pine tree or another gymnosperm might have. The proper botanical name for these structures are called catkins. And this is a pretty good field mark for the alder family. Now we've got a few species native. This is one of our non-native European alders that was planted here as a riparian shoreline stabilizing species. But our native alders have these little alder cones as well. And what's interesting about these is that you can find the larger ones that look like a teeny tiny little tree or pine cone. These are the female cones. And then you can also find the remains of little bitty ones from last year, and you can find some new ones for this year coming in. Those are the male catkins or male cones. So this is a tree that is what's called monoecious. It does produce the male and female reproductive parts on two separate structures, but each individual tree does contain both the male and the female parts. So this one's neat because we can find the old catkins from last year, we can find new ones that are just starting to form, and if we look close, we can find a few little beginning buds of springtime leaves on their way in. So this alder is still asleep, but starting to wake up. Well, these are new reproductive cones or catkins that are starting to form. They're not ready yet. They're not producing pollen, and the female cones aren't producing eggs. I wonder if anything might actually be blooming already in the wintertime. Well, rather than look all around for possibilities, maybe it might be easier if we just go ask some friends of mine. All right, well, I'm curious to know if anything is blooming right now in the wintertime. Rather than me run around looking at things that might be blooming, nature has already invented the perfect flower finders. Let's ask them. Hey, is anything blooming right now? All right, well, they're not going to answer me, of course, but we do have a way of asking them and finding out if any flowers are currently blooming. We've brought you to our apiary, our honeybee hives before, and of course, honeybees, like other insects, are ectotherms. The more common term for that is cold-blooded, and a lot of insects are not active in the wintertime. But honeybees are unique in that they are capable of keeping the internal temperature of the hive warm enough to sustain life just through friction of moving their bodies around. But what's more, even though it's wintertime, when it's a sunny day, and especially when the temperatures in the afternoon are 10 degrees or so above freezing, the honeybees will fly and they will forage. And they're looking for anything that the colony might be able to get nutrition from. But take a look at the little secrets they have to share with us. Many of them coming into the hive, you can see their little hind legs are stuffed full of brightly colored pollen. I see some pale yellow pollen coming in on many of their legs, and I also see a much darker, deeper orange pollen. So of course there are many more than 2 species that would be blooming now, but at least that's a very clear tell that some species are blooming right now in late winter, and here these honeybees are bringing that pollen back to the hive. Thanks, ladies. Well, would you looky here? Usually when we think about flowering plants, we think of spring and summer, and rightfully so. But there are a handful of species that have actually adapted to bloom at times when competition maybe with other species of plants is low. The wintertime. That's true for the witch hazels. The American witch hazel is the one native to here. It blooms usually around Thanksgiving or sometimes even into December. This is a Chinese witch hazel that blooms January, February. But all of the witch hazels are wintertime bloomers. And if you look closely, you can see these special adaptations on the flowers, these little coils, which when the night temperatures get really cold, these specialized petals will actually curl up to help insulate the fragile flower parts and the cell walls on the inside of the flowers. But then on a nice sunny day today, when the afternoon temperatures are above freezing, they open up to attract whatever pollinators might be out. And we met some of those pollinators a moment ago. My favorite part, smells like clove. There aren't a lot of plants that have this smell. Very cool. Well, we found some species that are still quite active in the winter, even while a lot of other plants and animals are asleep or dormant right now. But I would argue that there are a handful of species that we can better identify in the wintertime when they don't have those pesky canopy leaves all over them. I'll show you one now. Well, here's a species that has some pretty noticeable leaves in the warm months, but I would argue that it's even easier to identify when it's bare, when it's dormant for the winter. This, of course, is an American sycamore. You can always find it usually near the water's edge, or sometimes maybe there's not water on the surface, but it's very much a tree that likes to grow and keep its toes wet in water that's underneath the surface. But here in Steele Creek, finding it near the lake and the creeks is a wonderful place to find it. And this is a tree that is really distinctive by its bark. And you see it and you say, oh, well, that's a pretty nondescript bark. But you really identify it as you look up into the canopy. The bark exfoliates and reveals this whitish inner bark, really takes on a camouflage appearance. It really is a striking tree, especially in the winter time. Very cool. Well, thanks for coming along with me today as we discovered signs of life even in the winter. But whether it's winter or summer, or whether it's Steele Creek Park or any of our other local parks, be sure to get outside, because here's where you can be the explorer.